precious Renly commanded you to kill your own father and stand by while thousands of men, women, and children burned alive, would you have done it?
And for every one of the million people in that city, innocent or otherwise.
To be honest, I never really cared much for them, innocent or otherwise.
Jaime Lannister might just be one of the most intriguing characters in Game of Thrones. From the very beginning, he's portrayed as this skilled knight with a morally questionable streak, making him both intriguing and easy to hate. As the story unfolds, though, we see him transform into someone who genuinely seems to want redemption, capturing fans' attention and empathy. Yet, somewhere along the way, all that character growth went out the window, leaving a lot of us feeling let down. Fans saw him slowly peel away from his darker past, driven by a new sense of honor and self-worth. But then, in the later seasons, it felt like everything changed, and the Jaime we'd come to understand seemed to disappear. His storyline felt like a wasted opportunity, instead of the redemption story we'd been promised. From the sudden shifts in his loyalty to his puzzling final moments, Jaime's character arc became a cautionary tale in how not to handle complex storytelling. Let's dive in and see just where things went wrong for Jaime, the once great knight, who ultimately left fans frustrated. The bath scene between Jaime and Brienne of Tarth is one of the most defining moments for Jaime Lannister, shedding light on the complexity of his character in a way we hadn't seen before. It's here that Jaime, stripped of his usual armor, both literal and metaphorical, finally lets his guard down. He reveals to Brienne the true story behind why he killed the infamous Mad King. Instead of doing it for power or selfish gain, Jaime did it out of a genuine need to protect the people of King's Landing. As Jaime recounts that moment, it's clear he's haunted by the legacy it left him with. He was condemned as Kingslayer, and no one ever cared to understand his side of the story. In the bath, he explains that Ares had planned to set the entire city ablaze with wildfire, killing thousands of innocent people. Jaime was left with a choice: uphold his oath, to protect the king, or protect the people the king was meant to serve. It's a moment of vulnerability where Jaime finally reveals that he cared more for the lives he saved than for his reputation. Jaime's confession is incredibly powerful because it shows how deeply he values people, even if his actions don't always convey it. By killing the Mad King, he sacrificed his honor in the eyes of others to save countless lives. This truth is something he's carried in silence for years, bearing the weight of that decision alone. And as he speaks to Brienne, we see a side of Jaime that's been hidden beneath his pride and arrogance. A man capable of deep compassion. The connection he forms with Brienne in this scene is profound, as she's one of the few people who hears his side of the story. She begins to understand that Jaime isn't the heartless villain he's made out to be, and he's more than just the Kingslayer. In this vulnerable moment, Jaime's humanity shines through, setting the stage for his journey towards redemption. It's a scene that redefines how viewers see him, casting him not just as a flawed knight, but as someone who carries the burden of his choices, with a sense of moral conviction. The scene where Jaime tells Tyrion that he never really cared for the people of King's Landing is absolutely infuriating, especially after everything he told Brienne in the bathhouse. It's a complete contradiction of the story he shared with Brienne, where he claimed he killed the Mad King to protect innocent lives from burning. This confession almost feels like a slap in the face to anyone who bought into his redemption story. He wants us to believe he saved King's Landing out of necessity. Yet here he's practically dismissing that entire reasoning as if it never mattered. How can he reveal such a vulnerable truth to Brienne, painting himself as a reluctant hero, only to turn around and say he didn't care about the people he saved? The way he talks to Tyrion here feels like he's mocking anyone who ever saw him as more than just a Kingslayer. It's as if he's so wrapped up in his bitterness that he can't admit, even to himself, why he did what he did. Jaime's attitude in this moment makes it hard to believe he ever genuinely cared about doing the right thing. If saving King's Landing wasn't about the people, then what was it for? Was he just driven by his own ego? A desperate attempt to look good in his own eyes, while scorning anyone who dared to think he was a hero. This makes him seem like a coward, hiding behind his bitterness to avoid facing any real consequences of his choices. By the end of this conversation, Jaime comes across as someone who's torn down his own redemption arc. His words to Tyrion feel like a hollow excuse, an empty denial that completely undercuts the sacrifice he claimed to make. For a man who killed his own king to save innocent lives, to turn around and say those lives never mattered is just pathetic. Early on, Jaime's character arc was built around his quest for redemption. After losing his hand, he started to see the world, and himself, differently, and began moving away from his old, ruthless ways. This change was fascinating because it showed how even a character like Jaime, with all his flaws, could strive for something better. He fought alongside Brienne, saved people, and seemed genuinely interested in becoming a man of honor. But then, just when we thought he'd turned a corner, Jaime suddenly slipped right back into his old self. This betrayal of his own redemption arc was confusing, and honestly, felt like a slap in the face to fans. For seasons, we watched him make progress, only to see him revert to behaviors we thought he'd outgrown. It felt like the writers had just given up on his character development, tossing out all the growth he'd achieved. This flip-flop undermined Jaime's journey, making it hard to believe he'd really changed in the first place. In the end, what could have been an inspiring arc felt like nothing more than a wasted storyline. One of the biggest parts of Jaime's identity was his relationship with Cersei, a bond that was complicated and, frankly, toxic. As he grew as a character, he began to see how twisted this relationship was, realizing it brought out the worst in him. Jaime even made efforts to separate himself from Cersei, choosing a path that didn't revolve around her manipulations. He threw all of that away, returning to her as if none of his growth mattered. This decision was frustrating because it erased all the progress he'd made, pulling him back into a destructive cycle. Returning to Cersei felt like a step back for Jaime, undermining everything he'd worked toward. He had come so far in understanding how she manipulated him, yet he went right back as though he'd learnt nothing. This choice made his character feel inconsistent, as if he hadn't truly evolved beyond his past after all. It was a disappointing moment that left fans questioning whether any of his growth was ever real. His loyalty to her overshadowed any progress he had made, making his journey feel shallow. He was always torn between loyalty to his family and his duty to the realm. In later seasons, he seemed committed to serving a higher purpose, joining those fighting to save the realm from the White Walkers. It was a powerful moment when he chose to stand against Cersei and do what was right for the greater good. But by returning to her, he disregarded this responsibility, choosing personal attachment over the realm's safety. This choice was not just a personal failure, but also a betrayal of the values he'd come to represent. Neglecting his duty made Jaime look selfish, and it felt like his character had regressed. For a while, he seemed to care about the bigger picture, about doing something meaningful. But in the end, all that potential for greatness vanished, replaced by a choice driven purely by personal desire. This wasn't the Jaime fans had come to respect. It was someone stuck in his old ways. Ultimately, this decision made him a weaker character, proving that he'd learned nothing from his journey. As Jaime grew, one of his defining traits became his sense of honor. After his experiences with Brienne, he seemed to understand the value of loyalty and justice, trying to be a man of his word. He made tough choices that aligned with this code, even when it put him at odds with his family. But in the final season, it felt like this honor was just tossed aside, as he did whatever suited him in the moment. His actions seemed to serve only his immediate desires, forgetting the principles he'd developed. This inconsistency in his moral code made Jaime frustrating to watch in those last episodes. He'd gone from a character we could root for, to someone who felt unreliable and even cowardly. Abandoning his values like this made his character arc feel hollow, as if all that growth was just surface level. For a character who'd worked so hard to become honorable, it felt like a massive step backward. Jaime's lack of consistent values made him a weak character, undoing all the work that had gone into his arc. Jaime's relationship with Brienne of Tarth was probably one of the best connections in the show. Their bond was genuine, built on mutual respect, and brought out a softer, more honorable side of Jaime. Brienne encouraged him to live with integrity, pushing him to think beyond his family's influence and expectations. When they finally came together romantically, it felt right. It was the culmination of all their shared moments. But just as quickly, Jaime threw it all away, abandoning her to go back to Cersei. Leaving Brienne felt like a betrayal, not just to her, but to everything Jaime had become. After all the time he spent growing and evolving, it was like he'd decided none of it mattered. He left her without a second thought, making it seem like his character growth was just an illusion. This decision made him look selfish and insincere, diminishing the strength of their relationship. For a character we thought had finally found peace, this was a massive disappointment. When Game of Thrones ended, Jaime's story felt incomplete, like it was missing the closure he deserved. After everything he'd been through, you'd expect his character to reach some kind of meaningful conclusion. Instead, his death alongside Cersei felt hollow, like his entire journey had no real payoff. There was no moment of reflection, no sense that he'd truly come to terms with his choices. It left fans with a sense that his story was wasted, never fulfilling its potential. Jaime's ending didn't offer redemption, or even a final moment of self-awareness. It was just an abrupt close. For someone who had been on such a compelling journey, his conclusion felt rushed and unsatisfying. Fans had invested in his character, expecting an ending that would honor his growth, but got none of that. This lack of resolution made his entire arc feel pointless, as if everything he'd done was for nothing. His story is remembered not for its highs, but for the disappointing way it fizzled out.